Hey.
Hello.
Hey. Mark Charles here. Syndicated Schlimm, Totally Bashi. Syndicated Bashi, Totally Bashi. In the Navajo culture, when you introduce yourself, you always give your 4 clans. We're a matrilineal people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. So my mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and so I say Syndicated Schlimm, which translated means I'm from the Woodshoe people. My father's mother, my second clan, is Toahiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Syndicated. And then my 4th clan, my father's father, is Toahiglini, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. In the next 20 minutes, in the next hour and a half, we are going to go over some history that most of you have probably never heard of before. I know that we're in Charlottesville, and obviously there have been a lot of racial tension and even violence going on here in the past year, and I'm sure all of this is at the forefront of your mind. And this lecture is going to help you understand how this way of thinking became embedded into our foundations and into our country. And so I'm actually going to go all the way back to the teachings of Jesus and the history of the church to show where we've begun to kind of go off the rails to get to where we've gotten today. During the next hour and a half, I'm probably going to say some things that are going to offend some of you. I'm going to say some things that are probably going to make you want to stand up and walk out. And I'm going to say some things that a few of you may want to throw something at me. Resist all those impulses. But stay engaged. And we're going to get to a better place, but we have to get through a bunch of history we've never talked about before. Before we go much further, I want to just acknowledge the people whose land we're on. And we're on the land of the Monacan and the Haudenosaunee. So these were the 2 tribes that lived here. They farmed here, they hunted here, they fished here. They had society and villages and governance here long before Columbus got lost at sea. And wherever I travel, I like to acknowledge the people whose land I'm on. Is there anybody here from the Monacan or from the Haudenosaunee people tonight? Okay, I always like to ask, just because I like to acknowledge the people when I'm on their land. I want to start with this phrase, or this statement. There's an Aboriginal leader, his name is George Erasmus, and he says where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build a community, he says, you need to start by creating common memory. I think this quote gets to the heart of our nation's problem of race. Yeah. Which is we don't have a common memory. We have a dominant culture, a white America that has a history of discovery, opportunity, exceptionalism. And then we have communities of color that have the lived experience of stolen lands, broken treaties, slavery, Jim Crow laws, boarding schools, internment camps, separated families. And there's no common memory. And I think all of us, especially your community, can attest to the fact that community on a national level is almost non-existent today. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing is around this notion from George Erasmus that we need to create common memory. Now, I deeply believe that the United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. A conversation I would put on par with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that happened in South Africa, Rwanda, and Canada. Now, I want you to think about this statement for a minute. And 1 to 10. 1, you absolutely disagree with me, and 10, you absolutely agree with me. Don't say it out loud, don't raise your hand, but think of a number. The United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. A conversation that's on par with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that took place in South Africa, and Rwanda, and Canada. 1, you absolutely disagree with me. 10, you absolutely agree with me. Yes, we need this. Remember the number that's in your brain right now. Think about it. We're going to come back to it at the end of the lecture. I often tell people that you cannot understand the history of America without first understanding the history of the church. And so I go back not only to the founding fathers in our documents, I actually go back to the teachings of Jesus. So when Jesus came into this world, he had a dilemma, a challenge in front of him, which is that the people of Israel were under judgment. They were being oppressed, they were not able to worship freely, they weren't removed from their promised land, but they weren't free in their land either. And they were waiting for a political Messiah. They were waiting for someone to throw off the shackles of Rome and to bring them back into the greatness of the kingdom of David. Now Jesus understood this. I'm getting an echo here. There's an echo. Can we turn off these mics? Are these speakers? Do you know?
No.
Yes. No.
I don't know how.
It seems to have gone away.
It only happened once.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear?
It's not a, yes.
No, we don't hear the
it? Okay, you don't hear it.
It only happened once.
Okay. So Jesus came as the Messiah, but he was born in a barn, and he was raised as a refugee. Yes, angels announced his birth, but they were announced to a bunch of shepherds. He came in a way to demonstrate that he did not come to establish a Christian empire, a worldly kingdom. He came to do something very, very different. And remember, when he first was tempted, Satan took him up into a high place. And he showed him the kingdoms of the world and said, if you just bow down to me, I will give these kingdoms to you. And he said, no, that's not the plan, and he walked away. There was one day he was out, and he was teaching to about 4,000 men, probably about 8,000 to 10,000 people, and they were hungry, and so he found this kid, he grabbed his lunch, and he broke it in front of everybody and fed the whole crowd. And the people were so excited, they came to make him king by force. But Jesus said, no, that's not the plan. He walked away. When he sent for Pilate, ready to be crucified, and Pilate says to him, don't you know I have the power to set you free or to kill you? You need to answer my questions. And Jesus said, the only authority you have is what my Father in heaven gave to you. He said, you have no authority over me. If my kingdom were from this earth, my servants, the angels, would come and set me free. He said, my kingdom is from somewhere else. So Jesus was very, very clear. His kingdom was not of this earth. In fact, John the Baptist, one day when he heard Jesus was out healing the servants of centurions and raising the children of widows from the dead, John was so confused by this, because this was not what a political Messiah would be doing, that he sent his disciples to Jesus and said, hey, are you the one we're looking for, or should we expect somebody else? Jesus turned around, he fed more hungry people, he cast out more demons, he gave sight to more of the blind, gave hearing to more of the deaf, and said to John's disciples, go back and tell your master what you've seen. And blessed is the person who does not stumble on account of me. So Jesus was very adamant that he not only did not come to establish a political kingdom, but he actually came to suffer and die. Remember when he asked Peter, who do you think I am? And Peter said, you're the Messiah. And Jesus said that the Messiah had come to suffer and die and be persecuted. And Peter was so appalled by this that he pulled Jesus to the side and began to rebuke him. And Jesus looked up and saw his other disciples, and he turned to Peter and said, get behind me, Satan. You're not on the side of God, but of men. And so, ultimately, Jesus was crucified alone because all of his disciples left him. And so, when you join the early church in the first century, and you became a member of the church through your baptism, your confession, your discipleship, and your community, you knew that you were standing in opposition to empire. You knew that there was a good chance you would be persecuted and maybe even killed because of your membership in the church. Now, this went on for about 3 centuries. And then in the 3rd century, I always used to say Constantine was the one who imposed Christendom on the church. But as I've done my study, my research, I've realized it wasn't Constantine who thought up the idea of Christendom. There was a historian, a bishop of Caesarea named Eusebius. And Eusebius wrote a book called Ecclesiastical History, the history of the church. It's actually a very important book, and it covers the church basically from the life of Jesus until 300 AD. And throughout his book, he highlights the martyrs, the people who were killed for their faith. And he highlights how wonderful it was that they died with joy because of their sharing in the suffering of Christ. Now, if you're writing a book called The History of the Church, does this book have an ending? No, because when does it end? When does it conclude? When Christ returns, right? So if any of us were to write a history of the church book, it would be the start of a story, but it would not be the ending of the story, because the story will end when Christ returns. So when Eusebius wrote out his ecclesiastical history, you would think the book would not have a conclusion. And for the first 3/4 of the book, when he highlights the stories of the martyrs, and then towards the end of the book, he introduces Constantine's father. And he talks about Constantine's father as an emperor ordained by God. And then he talks about Constantine, his son, and he says basically he was a ruler chosen by God to rule for such a time as this. Now it sounds weird because this whole book is about Rome killing and persecuting the church. And suddenly, the bishop of Caesarea is identifying these 2 leaders as chosen by God and ordained by God to lead this empire. And then in one of the books, he has basically 13 stories of martyrs. It's called the Book of the Martyrs. And in this book, he identifies 13 martyrs who came from both Caesarea and Palestine, which is where Eusebius was from. And then he identifies that he witnessed most of these martyrs personally. So he saw them killed. His next book in this series, it's a volume of 11 books. After the Book of the Martyrs, his thinking on martyrdom changes, and now instead of the martyrs dying for the joy set before them, now they are suffering, and their suffering needs to end. And then he introduces this battle, gives this narration of this battle at Milvain Bridge, where Constantine defeats another emperor and consolidates his power within Rome. And Eusebius compares this battle to the Israelites crossing the Red Sea and Pharaoh and his soldiers dying in the Red Sea. And at the end of his book, in chapter 10, in book 10, Eusebius writes, he says, they celebrated after this battle and extolled, first of all, God, the universal king, because thus they were taught. Then they also celebrated the praises of the pious emperor Constantine. So who'd they miss? Jesus, right? We go from God to Constantine. Jesus is out of the story. And then in chapter 10, which is titled, again, Ecclesiastical History doesn't have a conclusion, correct? But the last chapter of the last book is titled The Victory of Constantine and the Blessings under him accrued to the whole Roman world. And towards the end of this chapter, he says, the supreme God granted from heaven above the fruits of his piety, the trophies of victory over the wicked, and the Narcissus tyrant with all his counselors and adherents he cast prostrate at the feet of Constantine. So what has Eusebius done? He's written Christ out of ecclesiastical history and replaced him with Constantine. I always thought Constantine imposed Christendom on the church. No. The church chose Constantine and replaced Christ with him. Why? Because he represented the best chance of ending their persecution. Yes. So, now that we've created Christendom, and we've written Christ out of Christendom and replaced him with a worldly emperor, now, I won't go through all these right now because it will take us a while, but, well, we'll just look at this. So, in his next book, which is about the life of the blessed Emperor Constantine, chapter 4 is titled How God Honored Constantine. Chapter 5 is titled He Was the Servant of God and the Conqueror of Nations. Chapter 6 was titled He Conquered Nearly the Whole World. Not talking about Christ. Talking about Constantine. Remember what Satan said to Jesus on the top of the mountain? If you bow down to me, I will give you the nations of the world. So in the 5th century, the theologians of the day had a challenge in front of them, which is, what do they do with Christendom? Do they speak prophetically to it, or do they collude with it? St. Augustine, who's writing in the 5th century, he creates a just war theory. Now, the just war theory has two purposes. The first purpose of the just war theory is to help the nation fight wars more justly. The second purpose of the just war theory is to justify how Christian citizens of a Christian empire can go off and kill in the name of Jesus. So I use the fact that there is a just war theory as a proof that the theologians are colluding with empire instead of speaking prophetically to it. But I was looking for the where does he cross the line? Where does he go off the rails, right? When you go off the rails with Jesus, when Peter says to Jesus, you don't have to die, what does Jesus say? You're behind me, Satan. When Jesus and James and John are walking out of Samaria and they've been rejected by the Samaritans, and James and John are kind of excited because they say to Jesus, cool, can we be the ones to call down fire from heaven and destroy them? Right? Because this is what happens in the Old Testament. When God sends a prophet and you listen to the prophet, he shows mercy. If he sends a prophet and you disobey the prophet, what does God do? Well, he smokes you, right? So James and John are kind of excited. They've been rejected by the Samaritans. And they're raising their hand and saying, Jesus, can we be the ones to call down fire from heaven and destroy them? Like Elijah. And what does Jesus say? No, he rebukes them, right? So when you cross the line with Jesus, he speaks very strongly. He reacts very strongly. So I'm wondering where in Augustine's writing would Jesus react so strongly? I read through his writings on the two kingdoms. I couldn't find the line across there. I read through his writings on just war theory. I couldn't find the line across there. And then I was looking at his book on the correction of the Donatists. Now, the Donatists are a group of people who are teaching heresy. They're leading people astray from the teachings of the Bible. And they've kind of been a thorn in Augustine's side his entire life. Now, in this book, he's wondering, what is the role of a Christian king in a Christian empire? We've never had this before. The empire has always been secular or even pagan. And now we have a Christian empire because we rejected Jesus, but we replaced him with Constantine. So we have a Christian empire in Christendom. And what's the role of the king in that empire? And he concludes the role is to prevent and chastise with religious severity all those acts which are done in opposition to the commands of the Lord. He says the Christian king of the Christian empire serves the Lord by enforcing with suitable rigor such laws as ordain what is righteous, and he punishes what is the reverse. In the next chapter, chapter 6, he says, it's better that men should be led to worship God by sound teaching than driven to it through fear and pain. But many have found advantage, he writes, in first being compelled by fear or pain, so that they might afterwards be influenced by sound teaching. So Augustine is arguing that the role of the Christian king in the Christian empire is to use the resources of the state to compel people to obey God through fear, punishment, and pain. Does that sound like Jesus?
Nope, no, but it sounds very.
Absolutely not. If Jesus didn't have a problem calling St. Peter Satan, I'm sure he would have no problem calling St. Augustine Satan. What are you thinking? You are not on the side of God, but of man. This line of thinking easily, over the next few centuries, morphs into what we call the Crusades. The Crusades are about expanding the empire as well as protecting Jerusalem. In the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas begins writing, and he's also dealing with the heretics. And he argues that if the secular state has the authority to kill people who breaks men's laws, how much more authority does the church have to kill people who break God's laws? For it's a much greater matter to corrupt the faith which quickens the soul than to forge money which supports temporal life. Wherefore, forgers of money and other evildoers are forthwith condemned to death by the secular authority. How much more reason is there for heretics, as soon as they are convicted of heresy, to not only be excommunicated, but even put to death? So now he's arguing the role of the Christian king in the Christian empire is to kill people who do not obey Christ or the commands of the church. Later in the 13th century, the church introduces a new word into its vocabulary. It's called the infidel. This is a subhuman category. It's applied to the Moors or to the Muslims. Later it's applied to indigenous peoples. Anyone who doesn't worship the God of the white European Christian male. Now that we have this subcategory, this subhuman category of infidel, now we don't even need a just war theory anymore, because now you're going to war based on your theological grounds. Now you're going to war against the enemies of Christ. So it's out of this, in 1452, that Pope Nicholas V writes out these words and says, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit. This papal bull, along with other papal bulls written between 1452 and 1493, collectively become known as what we call the Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery is essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their land is yours for the taking. This is literally the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people. They did not believe him to be human. It's the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was lost at sea, land in this new world which is already inhabited by millions and claim to have discovered it. You think about it, you can't discover lands already inhabited, right? If you don't believe me, leave your car keys, your cell phones, your laptops out. I'll come by and discover them for you. Clearly, this is not discovery, right? This is stealing. It's conquering. It's colonizing. The fact that on Monday we celebrated Columbus as the discoverer of America, this reveals the implicit racial bias of the nation, which is indigenous peoples, people of color, are not fully human. This makes the Doctrine of Discovery a white, male, Christian supremacist doctrine that is literally the fruit of a church that has prostituted itself out to the empire. Now the challenge is this doctrine has become embedded into the foundations of our country. So in 1763, King George draws a line down the Appalachian Mountains. And he says to the colonists who are here that they no longer have the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upsets the colonies. They want access to those lands. So a few years later, they write a letter of protest. In their letter, they accuse the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. They go on in the letters to state that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear the only reason our founding fathers used this inclusive term all men because they had a very narrow definition of who was actually human. This makes our Declaration of Independence a systemically white supremacist document that believes in the live superiority of white people over and against the bodies of Native Americans and people of color. Now, a few years later, our founding fathers write another document. They begin this one with the words, "We the people of the United States are from a more perfect union." This, of course, is our Constitution. But if you keep reading the Constitution past the preamble, just a few lines later, about 4 lines later, Article 1, Section 2. Now, Article 1, Section 2 is the passage of the section of the Constitution that defines who is and who is not covered by the Constitution. Who is and who is not a part of this union. The first thing we have to know about Article 1, Section 2 is that it never mentions women. Now, this is important because if you read the entire Constitution, from the preamble down to the end of the 27th Amendment, you will note that there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns. Who can run for office, who can hold office, even who is protected by this Constitution. 51, he, his, and him, and not a single female pronoun. Second, it specifically excludes Native. And third, it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So who's left? Technically, white landowning men. This is who could vote. White landowning men in the United States are going to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to white landowning men and white landowning men's posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. We have to remind ourselves the reason we have a Constitution, the reason it was written, is to protect the interests of white landowning men. So today we act surprised that women earn 70 cents to the dollar. This shouldn't surprise us. The Constitution's working. We act shocked that our prisons are filled with people of color. This shouldn't shock us. The Constitution's working. We act surprised that in 2010 the Supreme Court sides with Citizens United and rules that corporations now have the same rights to political free speech as individuals. Opens the door for super PACs, unlimited contributions to candidates. This should not surprise us. The Constitution is doing exactly what it's designed to do, is protecting the interests of white landowning men. And maybe you're thinking, wait, we've corrected that, right? Well, we tried. What does the 13th Amendment do?
Well, ostensibly free slaves, but it doesn't.
Most people think this is what the 13th Amendment says. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. Most people think the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, but it doesn't. What it actually says is neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, wherever the party has been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. So where is slavery legal? Yes. So let's take a look at our incarceration rates. Well, it should surprise no one that we incarcerate our citizens at the highest rate of any country in the world. For every 100,000 American citizens, we incarcerate 693 of them. That is 110 higher than the next nation, which is Turkmenistan, and about 3 to 5 times higher than most every other nation. This is comparing us just to NATO nations. And when we break these numbers out by race, they're even worse. We incarcerate Hispanics at a rate of 831, American Indians at a rate of 895, and Black Americans at a rate of 2,306. White people are, of course, incarcerated at a much more tolerable rate of 450 per 100,000. So just to be clear, slavery is still completely legal, and we use it today as a way to, we use the incarceration system as a way to enslave our peoples of color. Now, a few years later, we passed another amendment. We passed the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is actually a direct response to Article 1, Section 2. The 14th Amendment extends the right of citizenship to anyone born on this continent under the jurisdiction of the government. However, Section 2 of this amendment still specifically excludes natives. It still specifically excludes women. And it still makes the full rights of citizenship dependent on not being convicted of a crime. So while this amendment extends some rights of citizenship to a few former male slaves temporarily, it still leaves huge segments of the population marginalized and disenfranchised. And we forget that it was after this amendment we still had Jim Crow laws. We still had segregation. We still had Indian boarding schools. We still had Indian massacres. We still had internment camps. We still had the separation of families. And in 1970, we used this very same amendment in Roe versus Wade, and now concluded that unborn babies aren't human enough to be protected by the Constitution, and therefore they can be aborted. What this demonstrates is at the heart of our Constitution, there's no value for life. The value is actually for exploitation and profit, and the assumption is one of dehumanization. This means our Constitution is a systemically white supremacist and sexist document that assumes the white landowning male has the authority to decide who is and who is not human. Now, a few years later, about 100 years later actually 50 years later, we have a court case. Johnson versus McIntosh. It's two men of European descent. They're litigating over a single piece of land. One of them gets the land from the native tribe, the other one gets the same land from the government. They want to know who owned it. The case makes it all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has to decide the principle upon which land titles are based. So they rule that the principle was that discovery gave title to the government by whose subject and by whose authority it was made against all other European governments, and that title might be consummated by possession. They then go on to reference the doctrine of discovery as a legal instrument, and use this to conclude that natives, who are here first but are less than human, we only have what's called aboriginal title, the right of occupancy to the land. Like a fish would occupy water or a bird would occupy air. And Europeans have the fee title, the right of discovery to the land, and therefore they are the true title holders. This case, along with a few others in the 1820s, this is the John Marshall Court, create the legal precedent for land titles. Now, this precedent and the doctrine of discovery are referenced in name by the court in 1954, 1985, and most recently in 2005. But I want to talk for a moment about this 2005 case. So, the United Indian Nation at one point had about 6 million acres of land in what is now New York State. That land was later reduced through a treaty to 300,000 acres. And it was protected by another treaty for the use of the tribes. And the government said that no one could buy the land from the tribe except for the federal government. The state of New York continued to buy land from the United Indian Nation illegally. And eventually it got smaller and smaller, and soon it was pretty much all gone, and the tribe was pushed out of the state. In 1997, 1998, the United Indian Nation bought land in their traditional homeland. They went on the open market and bought some of their traditional land back. And they wanted to add it to their federal trust lands. So native tribes, our lands, we don't own our reservation lands. They're held in trust for us by the government, again, because natives aren't allowed to own land. We only have the right of occupancy. So the government holds our lands for us in trust, which means we don't own them, but it also means they're not taxable. And so the United Indian Nation bought this land and wanted to add it to their federal trust lands. Well, the land they bought was within the limits of the city of Sherrill, and the city of Sherrill, New York wanted their tax revenue from it, and so they sued the United Indian Nation. The United Indian Nation won their case in district court, so the city of Sherrill appealed to the Federal Court of Appeals. The decision was upheld, and so once again the city of Sherrill appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court overturned the decision of the lower courts in 2005, and this was their argument. First, they said that it is impractical to return this land after generations of being passed into numerous private hands. They said it's impossible to rescind the cession and restore Indians to their former rights because the lands have been open to settlement and large portions of them are now in possession of innumerable innocent purchasers. So now they're basically putting the burden on the Oneida Indian Nation. They also say this later, it's not on this quote, that they've waited too long. It's been 200 years until you brought this to the case, and you waited too long, and white people have moved in, and they've sold and bought the land, and now we can't do anything about it. This is their argument in 2005. They then make the argument that says, moreover, the properties here involved have greatly increased in value since the United sold them 200 years ago. Notably, it was not until lately that the United sought to regain ancient sovereignty over lands converted from wilderness to become part of cities like Sherrill. So they're saying, when you lived there, it was worthless land. Now that we've civilized it, now it's worth a lot of money. Now, this actually references almost directly back to what John Marshall wrote in 1823. When John Marshall was justifying why discovery gave title to the land and why the white people had title and the natives only had the right of occupancy, he argued that the tribes inhabiting this country were fierce savages whose occupation was war and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest. To leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness. The Chief Justice then argued that Europeans should not consider abandoning the country and relinquishing their pompous claim to it. Therefore, frequent and bloody wars in which whites were not always the aggressors unavoidably ensued. And as a result of European policy, numbers, and skills prevailed. As the white population advanced, that of the Indians necessarily receded. So, very, very white supremacist arguing that you were savages, the land was worthless, our superior intellect and policy and skill prevailed, and this is the same thing that they said back here, which is it's been converted from your savage forest into civilization now. And then they concluded, we now reject, this is in 2005, we now reject the unification theory of the United Indian Nation and the United States and hold that standards of federal Indian law, and in the first footnotes of the case, they reference the doctrine of discovery binding, which is the standard of federal Indian law and federal equity practice, and this precludes the tribe from rekindling embers of sovereignty that long ago grew cold. Now, this is 2005. Anyone want to venture a guess what Supreme Court Justice wrote this decision? Scalia?
Rehnquist.
Rehnquist? Any other guesses? Kennedy?
No! I'm so done. No!
White supremacy is a bipartisan value.
Interesting. Okay.
Now in 1630, John Winthrop was in what today is called the Boston Harbor. And he was with a group of colonists, and they were here to plant the Boston colony. And on this boat, he preached a sermon called A Model of Christian Charity. In his sermon, he referred to the colonists as a city upon a hill. He's borrowing from the language of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount when he told his disciples to be a lamp on a stand, a city on the hill, shine your good deeds into this dark world. He goes on in his sermon to exhort them in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. They should rejoice together and mourn together, labor and suffer together. They should keep the unity of the spirits within the bonds of peace. These are your basic Christian church exhortations. At the end of the sermon, he wants to encourage the people to obey his exhortations, and so he begins quoting from the scriptures, and he quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 30. Now, Deuteronomy 30 is the passage in the Old Testament where the people of Israel are standing on the banks of the Jordan River, ready to cross over and take possession of their promised land. And God's reiterating the threats and promises of his land covenant. If you obey me, I'll do these things for you. If you disobey me, I'll do these things to you. At the end of this passage, it says, but if our heart shall turn away so that we will not obey and we worship other gods, we will surely perish out of this good land, whether we cross over this river to possess it. Now, Deuteronomy 30 says river, but in his sermon, John Winthrop changes the word river to vast sea. Now, why would he change it to vast sea? Well, they didn't cross the river, they crossed an ocean. So he's implying, based on the model of Old Testament Israel, based on the Sermon on the Mount, we are standing on the shores of our promised land, ready to go and take possession of it. Now, who here has read the book of Deuteronomy and Joshua? How does God command the Israelites to take possession of their promised land? Kill everybody. Leave no man, no woman, no child, no animal left alive. Promised land for one people is literally God-ordained genocide for another. I call this sermon the birth of American exceptionalism. This idea percolates for about 100 years. This is the 1630s. Mid-1700s, we begin expanding westward. We go past the Appalachian Mountains. We go past the Mississippi River. End of the 1700s, we have the Second Great Awakening. Early 1800s, we have the term manifest destiny being coined. This belief that these white Europeans have the God-given right to rule this land from sea to shining sea. Now, how deeply is this embedded in the American psyche? Think back about 3 years ago. President Obama was negotiating a treaty with Iran, a nuclear treaty, and Benjamin Netanyahu was here in the U.S. lobbying against that treaty. He was invited by the Republican leadership to address a joint session of Congress, and he was talking to a very divided, a very partisan Congress, as well as American country. And he had to find the theme that would unify everybody. He had to get everyone on his side behind him. And so he, very early in his speech, chose to affirm what we call American exceptionalism. And he said to our country, because America and Israel, we share a common destiny, the destiny of promised lands. See, the United States of America and the modern nation state of Israel have a very dysfunctional codependent relationship. We depend on Israel's Old Testament legacy of promised land to justify our treatment of native peoples and African peoples. And the modern nation state of Israel needs our flourishing as a nation with a manifest destiny to justify their current mistreatment of the Palestinians and the Bedouins. We have a very dysfunctional, codependent relationship with the modern nation state of Israel. It has almost nothing to do with human rights. It's merely about justifying our histories and our current day injustices. So now that we have a white supremacist Doctrine of Discovery, a white supremacist Declaration of Independence, a white supremacist and sexist Constitution, a white supremacist Supreme Court, and a God-given right to commit genocide, now we have some history we have to talk about. I want you to think about the 19th century. The 19th century is the century we call our century of expansion. This is the century we add about 30 new states to the Union. I made this chart. This is our nation from 1775 to 2016. Every year in blue is a year I found we were in a declared state of war or armed military conflict against another nation or entity.
Whoa, that's not me.
Every year in red is every year we fought against native tribes. These are the wars I found we fought primarily during the 19th century. Clearly this was not a century of expansion. This is a century of ethnic cleansing and genocide. It's during this century that in 1830 we passed the Indian Removal Act. This is the act that in practice gives Congress the right by force to remove tribes from their land in the east to more empty lands further in the west. This results in the Trail of Tears for the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee. This results in the Long Walk, the Navajo, and the Apache, the Pueblos. All told, about a dozen tribes experienced forced relocation, and tens of thousands of people died as a direct result of this act. In 1862, we have the largest mass execution in the history of our country, with the hanging of the Dakota 38, ordered by Abraham Lincoln. In 1864, we have the Cheyenne and Arapaho on their reservation in Colorado, and they are massacred by a U.S. colonel named Colonel Shivington, who was actually also a Methodist pastor. After this massacre, about 150, 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho people died, and later the soldiers are reported parading their genitalia down the streets of Denver. In 1879, we have the start of Indian boarding schools. Native children are taken from their homes. They're raised in these military-style boarding schools. They're punished for speaking their languages. They're punished for practicing their culture. They're forcibly assimilated to white European American culture. The stories of abuse, neglect, sexual assault that happened to these kids from both their government and church-run boarding schools is appalling. And the last of these schools don't close until the 1970s and 80s. In 1890, we have the massacre of Wounded Knee. This is a bit more famous massacre. We talk about this a bit more in our history books. But there's certain aspects of this massacre we don't talk about. So, in 1890, the U.S. Army and the Dakota tribe were negotiating the surrender of a Dakota chief. And they were meeting at Wounded Knee. And neither side trusted each other. There was a lot of weapons present, and neither side trusted each other, and no one knows exactly what happened. But someone shot their gun off. They don't know if it was a U.S. soldier or a native warrior, but someone fired their weapon and chaos ensued. Now the Army had up to 4 what are called Hotchkiss cannons there. These are large cannons. They shoot about 70 rounds per minute. They're accurate up to about 2,000 yards. They had about 4 of them there. And so they began raining bullets down on the Dakota people. And the Dakota people are running, there's a ravine right there at Wounded Knee, and they're running into the ravine to seek shelter from these guns. Now, one of the things we don't teach about Wounded Knee is that the U.S. Army awarded 20 Medals of Honor to the U.S. soldiers who participated in this massacre. And 3 of them, the one for William Austin, John Gresham, and Albert McMillan, were awarded specifically for flushing the native peoples out of the ravine. In 1840, this is what our country looked like. The dark states on the east are the actual states, and the lighter colors to the west are the territories and uncharted lands. If you go onto the U.S. military's website, you will find a place where you can look up Medals of Honor by war and by conflict. And if you look up Medals of Honor for the Indian War campaigns, you will note that between 1839 and 1898, the U.S. Army awards 425 Congressional Medals of Honor to U.S. soldiers who participated in the Indian Wars.
What are the dates?
Medal of Honor recipients for the Indian Wars.
No, what are the dates between?
1839 and 1898. And at the end of this period, this is what the country looks like. During this century, the white population, the U.S. population, ballooned from 5.3 million to 76.2 million, and the native population shrinks from 600,000 to 237,000. If you're looking at that as a rate of genocide, that's a 61.47% rate of genocide during the 19th century. If you compare that to Nazi Germany, they had a 35% genocide rate for Jewish people during the Holocaust. So just to be clear, between 1839 and 1898, the U.S. Congress awards 425 Medals of Honor for the ethnic cleansing and genocide of indigenous peoples. But I want to go back and talk about the boarding schools because I want to talk about what a term you're very familiar with, which is white supremacy. Now, the general perception in America is that we have a large population of people who have a racial bias, who do racist things, and we have a smaller subset of people who are white supremacists. These are the KKK members, these are the Confederate flag flyers, these are the Breitbart editors. Now, I want to actually argue and make the case that I think we need to flip the two. I would argue we have a large number of people with an implicit bias of white supremacy, and we have a smaller subset of people who are proactively racist. Racism is the act of doing something negatively, intentionally, because of someone's race or the color of their skin. And I want to look at this through the lens of the Indian boarding schools. So in 1892, this is 2 years after Wounded Knee, the nation was having a challenge because it was not looking good to continue to do outright genocide the way they've been doing to Native peoples for the entire century. They were having a bit harder time justifying it, it wasn't looking good on the global stage, and yet they still wanted the lands of the Native peoples. And so they had what was called the Indian problem. What do we do with these Native peoples? We want their land, but it doesn't look good to keep killing them the way we've been doing this. And so in 1892, Richard Pratt, who was a U.S. Army officer, builds his case for the boarding schools to address what he calls the Indian problem. And he says, rather than just outright killing the Indian, let's kill the Indian to save the man. Let's forcibly assimilate them into white European Christian culture. Now, once he makes this statement, he begins building his case by looking at the history of slavery. And he says, that as horrible as was the introduction and experiences of slavery itself, there was concealed in them the greatest blessing that ever came to the Negro race. 7 million of blacks from cannibalism in darkest Africa to partial citizenship in free and enlightened America. Left in Africa, surrounded by their fellow savages, our 7 million industrious black fellow citizens would still be savage. Transferred into these new surroundings and experiences, behold the result. They became English-speaking and civilized. And how did this happen? They became English-speaking and industrious through the influences of association. Scattered here and there under the care and authority of individuals of the higher race, their slave owners, they learned self-support and something of citizenship, and so reached their present place. No other influence or force could have so speedily accomplished such a result. The problem are the challenges. Racism is an intentionally negative act, whereas white supremacy can look benevolent and even charitable. And to the white supremacist mind, the most benevolent and charitable thing they can do is to allow the people of the lower races to associate with them. And I want you to think about this. Why is assimilation such a high value in America? Are we assimilating to black culture? Our native culture? No, we're assimilating to white culture. Right? Why do so many of our mission agencies and churches today get their foot in overseas missions by doing what? Teaching English. Why do we call it white privilege? Because white privilege makes it sound like a blessing to be shared. Instead of a diseased theological construct that needs to be confronted. I would argue we have a wide umbrella of people in this country who believe in the lie of white supremacy. At their core, they literally believe that they are superior. And it doesn't come out in negative ways. It comes out in benevolent and charitable ways by allowing the people of the lower races to associate with them and assimilate to their way of life and to become like them. In December 19, 2009, Congress passes House Resolution 3326. This is the 2010 Department of Defense Appropriations Act. It's a 67-page document laying out the appropriations for the DoD for 2010. Page 45, subsection 8113, is titled Apology to Native Peoples of the United States. What follows is the 7-bullet point apology. It mentions no specific tribe, no specific treaty, and no specific injustice. Basically says you had some nice land. Our citizens didn't take it very politely. Let's now just call it all of our land and steward it together. Then it ends with a disclaimer saying nothing in here is legally binding. Who signed this bill?
Nobody.
President Obama.
Did you? Oh,
2010.
oh, that's right.
To date, this bill has not been announced, read, or publicized by the White House or by Congress.
Did it, was it voted up or down?
It was passed. It was buried.
Right. Huh. Did Obama read that section?
No. I found a press release from the White House the day this bill was signed. It mentioned the bill, it mentioned the Department of Defense, made no mention of the apology. The problem is, we don't teach a history of our country, we teach a mythology. The mythology is that we have a legacy of discovery, we believe in equality, we have a history of expansion, we're exceptional, liberty and justice here exist for everybody, and we're a Christian nation. Now I want you to realize how deep this mythology goes. Who here has been to the Lincoln Memorial? Okay, keep your hands up. Who here has been to the museum at the base of the Lincoln Memorial? Okay, less of you. In the base of the museum of the Lincoln Memorial, there's a small museum about a quarter of the size of this room, maybe a third of the size of this room. On each wall, there are plaques of different speeches and writings and sayings and quotes of President Lincoln. And on one wall is a series of quotes about the Union. Each of these quotes are about the size of the middle squares of these windows. And on one of these walls, or one of these quotes in the middle of that wall, is this quote. It says, "I will save the Union. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. It's not to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do it. If I could save by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." There's a quote hanging in the Lincoln Memorial, which literally states, according to Abraham Lincoln, Black lives don't matter. I don't know what's more offensive, the fact that he said it, or that someone felt it was fit to hang them.
Right.
Again, the problem is we don't teach a history of a country, we teach a mythology. The history says, the mythology says discovery, the history says dehumanization. The mythology says equality, the history says only for a select few. The mythology says expansion, the history says ethnic cleansing. The mythology says exceptionalism, the history says genocide. The mythology says liberty and justice for all, the history says liberty and justice for white landowning men. The mythology says Christian nation, the history says Christendom. Now, maybe you're thinking that's a bit strong, Mr. Charles. I want you to think back. About a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, there was a series of terrorist attacks in London. One specifically in Europe. There's one specifically in London where someone drove their car into a crowd and came out with a knife and stabbed some people. On the day of that attack, Clay Higgins, who is the U.S. Congressman from Louisiana, he represents their 3rd district. On his website, he identifies himself as a Christian who is known for his refreshing focus on the power of the individual to be redeemed. On the day of this terrorist attack, on his public Facebook page, this is what he wrote. The free world, all of Christendom, is at war with Islamic horror. Not one penny of American treasure should be granted to any nation who harbors these heathen animals. Not a single radicalized Islamic suspect should be granted any measure of quarter. Their intended entry to the American homeland should be summarily denied. Every conceivable measure should be engaged to hunt them down, hunt them, identify them, and kill them all. For the sake of all that is good and righteous, kill them all. Clay Higgins, U.S. Congressman, 3rd District of Louisiana, June 4th, 2017. And believe it or not, Facebook did not even take it down as hate speech.
Right.
Now I want to pause here for a moment. Take a little breath. There's no right or wrong answer, and there's no good or bad answer. I don't need your entire story. I want 3 words or less. How does this history make you feel? There's no right or wrong answer. There's no good or bad answer. 3 words or less. How does this history make you feel?
Sick.
Sick.
Disgusted.
Worthless.
Disgusted.
Worthless. Horrible.
Worthless. Horrible.
Angry.
Angry. Cheated.
Heartbroken.
Heartbroken.
Duped.
Sad. Duped.
Guilty.
Guilty. Vindicated.
Shame.
Ashamed. Confused. Yeah. These are good. We don't talk about this history because we don't know what to do with it. We don't talk about the church because we don't know what to do with it. This history is actually very discombobulated for us as Americans. Now, this was the longest section, but we have 2 more sections I want to get through, and the next section is even worse. Believe it or not. And then the third section is a bit better. So, one of the challenges we face as a country, I would argue, is that we've never lost a war that matters. We've never lost a war that matters. We've never lost land. We've never had to surrender. We've never been overtaken. We've never had to bare our soul in front of the shame of the globe. We've never lost a war that matters. Technically, the Korean War never ended, or maybe it just ended a few months ago. Vietnam, we pulled out, but we didn't surrender, and we didn't lose any land or anything else. And most every other war we fought as a country, we have won. Now, who writes the history books?
The winners.
The victors write the history books. So this means we have written our own history for 250 years. Now this is incredibly dangerous. Let me help you understand this. If I had to ask you to guess the most deadly man-caused 24-hour period in human history, what would your guess be?
Hiroshima.
Hiroshima. Any other guesses?
9/11.
Nagasaki?
9/11.
9/11.
Dresden.
I hear you.
Firebombing of Dresden.
Firebombing of what?
Dresden.
Dresden.
Dresden. Okay. Technically, it was Operation Meeting House, which was the firebombing of Tokyo. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had 60,000 and 40,000 people killed instantly. Operation Meeting House, in a single night, we killed 100,000 people. We actually chose Tokyo for this bombing because we knew it was a wooden city and would burn hotter. And we did this to test flying formations and other strategies that we would use later when we bombed Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Now, why don't we know this? Why don't we know this?
Someone else wrote it out.
Do you think the Japanese people know this?
Oh, yes, they do.
Why do they know it?
But it happened to them.
They lost the war. Why don't we know it?
We won.
We won the war. Okay? So I want you to think for a moment. Let's pretend Germany wins World War II. Okay? How do their history books portray Hitler? Messiah? Brilliant strategist? Great leader, benevolent leader? Okay? How would the German history books treat the Holocaust?
Necessary.
Necessary?
For the greater good.
For the greater good? How about what Holocaust?
Oh, yes.
Okay? So who's our greatest president? Not your greatest president. Our greatest president collectively as a nation.
FDR.
Lincoln.
Most Americans, based on people who visit the memorial, as well as polls taken every year, for the last 2 decades, Lincoln has almost unanimously been chosen as our greatest president. Now, why is he our greatest president? Well, he's the great emancipator, he's the great unifier, he won the Civil War, and he abolished slavery. But remember, our history has not been checked in 250 years. So I want to check some history tonight. So to understand Lincoln, you have to read the Lincoln-Douglas debates. In the 1850s, debates were different than they are today. They weren't a back and forth dialogue between the candidates. They were a series of speeches. Your first candidate would make an opening speech, probably talk for about 40, 50 minutes. The second candidate would respond or have another speech. They talked about an hour. Then the first candidate would come back and he would have another speech of about 20 to 30 minutes. So it was a series of 3 speeches. And Lincoln had a challenge, which is A, he was fairly unknown, but B, what was known about him was that he was against chattel slavery. And so he had to convince people who he was and where he stood on issues. And so in one of the first speeches of the president of the Senate debates in 1858 with Stephen Douglas, he said, "I will say here while upon this subject that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I have no purpose to introduce political and social equality between the white and black races. There is a physical difference between the two, which in my judgment will probably forever forbid their living together upon the footing of perfect equality. And inasmuch as it becomes a necessity that there must be a difference, I, as well as Judge Douglas, am in favor of the race to which I belong having the superior position." A month later, in another debate, he said the same thing almost verbatim. I will say then that I am not, nor have been in favor of bringing in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. To applause. That I am not, nor have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of allowing them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two from living together in terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. In his inaugural address in 1861, he felt the need to address this once again when he said, apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the ascension of a Republican administration, their property and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. I declare that, and now he just begins quoting himself from the Lincoln-Douglas debates. At the inauguration, Congress was in a tizzy. Some southern states were already threatening to secede from the Union, and they were trying hard to keep the country together. And so literally, 5 a.m., 6 a.m. on Inauguration Day, the Senate passes what is called the Corwin Amendment. The Corwin Amendment constitutionally protects slavery in the states where it already exists. It says, no amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to service, to labor or service by the laws of the said state. Now, the outgoing Democratic administration was so convinced that this was such an important amendment that even though the president has no role in amending the Constitution, the outgoing president took the liberty of endorsing this amendment. And in his inaugural address, Abraham Lincoln also addressed this amendment, and he said, I understand a proposed amendment to the Constitution, which amendment, however, I have not seen, has passed Congress to the effect that the federal government shall never interfere with the domestic institutions, so the state, including that of persons held to service. To avoid misconstruction of what I said, I depart from my purpose not to speak of amendments, so far as to say that holding such a provision to now by implied constitutional law, I have no objection to its being made express and irrevocable. So Senate passed the amendment. Even though the president is not in charge of the amendments, Lincoln takes the action of personally mailing this amendment out to each of the governors for their endorsement, but it does not get ratified by the states, even though Lincoln supported it. In 1862, the spring of 1862, President Lincoln signs the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act opens up land west of the Mississippi for anyone willing to go and settle it. Provides 160 acres to anyone who's willing to live there for 5 years. In July of 1862, Abraham Lincoln signs the Pacific Railway Act. The Pacific Railway Act completes Manifest Destiny. It provides the land and the resources to complete the Transcontinental Railway and the telegraph lines, which have so far made it to Omaha, Nebraska. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln has the Emancipation Proclamation written, it's in his desk. And Horace Greeley, who is the editor of the New York Tribune, has written a scathing op-ed calling for the immediate emancipation of the slaves. Abraham Lincoln, though, is troubled. He's concerned because there are 4 states in the North that have not seceded from the Union that allow slavery, and he doesn't want to wrestle with the political fallout if he emancipates the slaves now. These are the states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. And so he responds to Horace Greeley's op-ed by basically, with the quote we read that's in the Lincoln Memorial, I'm not doing this because I care about the slaves, I'm doing this to save the Union. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. In the fall of 1862, the U.S. goes to war against the Dakota people. Actually, the U.S. and Dakota had signed a treaty earlier And in this treaty, the Dakota gave up some land, and the U.S. promised to provide for them and give them the provisions they needed through the winters, and so on and so forth. Well, the winter of 1861 came and went, and the Dakota people nearly died because the U.S. Army, the U.S. government did not meet its treaty obligation. So in the fall of '62, some of the young men are out one day and they go into a white settlement and they raid it and they steal some eggs and get into a battle with some of the settlers, and they end up killing some of the settlers. They go back to their tribe and they tell their leaders what they have done. The elders of the tribe, they basically have a war council and they decide, we need to go to war. So reluctantly, they decide to go to war against the U.S. Army because they know they will not make it through another winter without their treaty obligations being met. So this starts a very bloody 31, 32-day war between the U.S. and the Dakota people. There's a lot of people killed on both sides. At the end of the 30 days, half of the Dakota warriors flee north to Canada, the other half surrender. They are immediately, those who surrender are put into military tribunals, and now they're being judged by the same people they were just fighting. These tribunals, these cases last just a few minutes. They're brought through, they don't speak the language, they share witnesses, no one really knows what's going on. End of the period of these trials, over 400 of these warriors are condemned to death. Because these are military tribunals, they have to be signed off by the president, and so the order goes to Abraham Lincoln, and 400 hangings in a single day seems too genocidal for Lincoln. But even though these trials are clearly a legal sham, he doesn't order retrials. What he does is he changes the criteria of what warrants a death sentence. Under his new criteria, only 2 of the warriors are going to die. Now he's afraid his white settlers are going to rise up. So again, instead of ordering retrials, for a second time, he changes the criteria of what warrants a death sentence. And he lands on the magic number of 38. That's palatable to him. So the day after Christmas, 1862, several thousand white settlers come out, and they sing hymns of praise as the largest mass execution in the history of our country takes place with the hanging of the Dakota 38. In January of '63, the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. Now, if you've never read the Emancipation Proclamation, it's actually very specific where it frees the slaves. They're freed in Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. What's missing from this list?
Maryland.
Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, the 4 southern states. Those states did not receive freedom, and in fact, they didn't get their freedom until after Lincoln died. And it says the accepted parts are for the present left precisely as if this proclamation had not been issued. In February of 1863, after the Dakota War and the hanging of the Dakota 38, Abraham Lincoln nullifies all of the treaties with the Winnebago and the Dakota people in Minnesota.
Oh.
In March of '63, he signs another bill which gives him the right, without treaty or negotiation, to remove the tribes from the state of Minnesota. That removal begins in the month of April, and it lasts until the fall. The Winnebago and the Dakota people are loaded up onto trains, they're put onto barges, they're put onto ships, and they're shipped out of Minnesota into the Dakota Territory. Many people die along the way. The place where they're brought to is not sustainable for all the people who are living there, and they're not living in good conditions while they're there, and it's a very inhumane process as he moves them out of the state of Minnesota. In the fall of '63, Abraham Lincoln's General Carleton, gives this order to Kit Carson in the territory of New Mexico. He says, henceforth, every Navajo male is to be killed or taken prisoner on sight. Say to them, go to the Bosque Redondo, or we'll pursue you and destroy you. We will not make peace with you on any other terms. This war shall be pursued until you cease to exist or you move. There can be no other talk on the subject. So Kit Carson goes through the Navajo territory, this is my people's territory, He burns our hogans, he burns our crops, he kills our livestock, and he basically keeps us on the run all throughout the Nepe, our traditional lands. And a historian named Raymond Friday Locke, in his book called The Book of the Navajo, writes that by the end of December, most of the weak and the aged had died. There is hardly a Navajo family that cannot remember tales of an aged grandfather, a pregnant mother, or a lame child that had to be left behind when the camp had to be quickly deserted. The patrols were not interested in keeping captive. It was too much trouble to transport them back to the fort. Any Navajo they saw was shot on sight. Mothers were sometimes forced to suffocate their hungry, crying babies to keep the families from being discovered and butchered by an army patrol or taken captive by the slave raiders. In February 1864, or January 1864, Abraham Lincoln signs an order creating Bosque Redondo. Bosque Redondo is called a reservation, but it's essentially a prison camp or even a death camp. Over the next several months, nearly 10,000 Navajo men, women, and children are forcibly marched down to Bosque Redondo. Hundreds of our people die along the way due to exposure and starvation, and about a quarter of our people die while they are imprisoned there under gunpoint. The land cannot be farmed. It has alkali in the soil. There is no trees to make fire with. Basically, our people have to walk 10 to 15 miles a day just to find anything to burn or eat, and we're fed the rotting food left over from the army meals. And in the end, about a quarter of our people die while they're in prison there. In his address to Congress in 1863, Abraham Lincoln proudly announces that 1.4 million acres were taken up under the Homestead Act. In July of '64, he signs the Pacific Railway Act. The Pacific Railway Act completes Transcontinental Railway. It provides, it doubles the amount of land and gives the rest of the resources to get the Transcontinental Railway all the way to the Pacific Ocean. In 1864, so to understand the Sand Creek Massacre, in 1850, under a treaty, the U.S. government essentially gives the territory of Colorado, or allows the territory of Colorado to become the treaty lands for the Cheyenne and the Arapaho Indians. In 1855, gold is discovered in the Rocky Mountains. And immediately, prospectors and settlers begin encroaching on their land and taking their land. And so in the early 1860s, the Lincoln administration renegotiates a treaty with the Cheyenne and Arapaho and reduces their land holdings to 1/13 of what it used to be. In 1864, they are on their reservation. They're on their land. They are waving a white flag of surrender, and they are waving an American flag. I believe it was the same flag they received when they negotiated with Abraham Lincoln. And a U.S. Army comes over the hill, and he sees these men and women and children, and he orders all of them slaughtered. 200 people die that day. They parade their genitalia down the streets of Denver. Within a year and a half, within 2 to 2.5 years after this massacre, the Cheyenne and Arapaho completely surrender, and they are moved from Colorado to the state of Oklahoma. In his annual message in 1864, Abraham Lincoln announces that 1.5 million acres were entered upon the Homestead Law, and that the great enterprise of connecting the Atlantic with the Pacific states by railway and telegraph lines has been entered upon with a vigor that gives assurance of success. See, the Transcontinental Railway at this point had made it up to Omaha, Nebraska, and there are 3 primary routes that it's trying to go through. The main route goes from Nebraska into Wyoming, Colorado, Nevada, and down near San Francisco. The northern route starts in Duluth, Minnesota, goes through the state of Minnesota, North Dakota, Montana, and into Oregon, and comes out near Seattle in Washington. And the southern route goes through the territory of New Mexico and comes out near Los Angeles. Within 2.5 to 3 years of signing the first Pacific Railway Act, Abraham Lincoln has ethnically cleansed all the tribes from the state of Minnesota, the state of Colorado, and the state of New Mexico. Now his legacy, of course, is the 13th Amendment. Who's seen the Documentary 13? So the Documentary 13 does a fairly good job of connecting the 13th Amendment to mass incarceration. But to understand the 13th Amendment, because this is Lincoln's baby, right? This is his legacy. This is what he was supposedly fighting for all his entire life. But to understand the 13th Amendment, you have to understand the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Judge Douglas accuses Abraham Lincoln of applying the Declaration of Independence to black people. And Lincoln responds and says, I think the authors of that notable instrument intended to include all men, but they did not mean to declare all men equal in all respects. They did not mean to say they were equal in size, color, intellect, moral development, or social capacity. Now, he's not talking about individuals. This man's taller, that man's smarter. He's talking about race. One's superior, one's inferior. Later, Judge Douglas accuses Lincoln of wanting to make citizens of black people. On top of what Lincoln has already said, I have no intention of freeing the slave. There's a physical difference. I will never make voters or jurors of black people or allow them to intermarry. When specifically questioned, he responds and says, Judge Douglas has said to you that he has not been able to get from me an answer to the question whether I'm in favor of Negro citizenship. So far as I know, the judge has never asked me the question before. Applaud. He shall have no occasion to ever ask it again. I tell him very frankly, I am not in favor of Negro citizenship.
And these are part of the Lincoln-Douglas debate.
Yes. It is my opinion that the different states have the power to make a Negro citizen under the Constitution of the United States. If the state of Illinois had that power, I should be opposed to the exercise of it. Cries of good, good, and applause. That is all I have to say about it. So he had a dilemma. Now, most people will say, well, he grew and he learned over his presidency. Yes, he was a white supremacist in the Senate, or when he ran for Senate, but he later became friends with Frederick Douglass, and he learned about the value of black people, blah, 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 blah. Well, the years he was friends with Frederick Douglass are the exact same years he was ethnically cleansing and committing genocide against Native peoples. So had Hitler become friends with a hippie or a gypsy while he's still running the death camp, is that correct? So Lincoln had a problem. He did not like chattel slavery, not because he cared about black people. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he and Judge Douglas absolutely agree on white supremacy. They both get laughs from the audience by preposterously proposing that black people might be equal to white people. They both get wild cheers by intentionally endorsing white supremacy. They both agree on white supremacy. They disagree on slavery. Judge Douglas believes we need slavery to keep our white supremacy intact. And Lincoln's convinced that we can keep white supremacy intact even without this institution of slavery. He says this is the greatest threat we've ever had as a nation, which is this institution of slavery. He's not worried about blacks revolting or rising up. He's not worried about other nations coming in and freeing them. He's saying this is going to cause white people to kill each other. We have this great white supremacy thing going on, and we can't agree. We're going to destroy each other fighting about it. So what do you do with your slaves if you don't want to have chattel slavery anymore, but you don't believe they're equal and you don't want to make them citizens?
Deport them to Africa.
No, you make a subhuman, a subsection class of citizenship.
That'll work. It has.
Where their rights can be removed on a whim by a white judge, a white jury, and a white law enforcement officer. Mass incarceration was the brainchild of Abraham Lincoln. This is what you do with your black people. Your people of color, you don't want them to be citizens, and you don't believe they're equal.
Right.
I think you would be quite proud of the fact that Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, George Bush learned how to massively incarcerate our people of color. So that in 2013, we had nearly twice as many African American male parolees and men under state and federal correction supervision than we had enslaved in 1850. So why is Abraham Lincoln our greatest president? He's not the great emancipator. He unified white people. He didn't win the Civil War. The war he won was the War of Manifest Destiny. Civil War was just an internal spat between white people. They couldn't agree how to get along in this white supremacist society they had. The major war he won was that of discovery and manifest destiny. This is what he says, what's we hold most dear amongst us? Our own liberty and prosperity. What has ever threatened our liberty and prosperity more? Save this institution, accept this institution of slavery. Tell the white people, slavery is going to rip us apart. We have a great thing going on here. Slavery is going to destroy it for us. He didn't abolish slavery, he protected white supremacy. He gave us the tools that we are using today. Think about what happened in Philadelphia, right? There's two black men in a store, and a white manager doesn't want them there. So she calls the cops. She doesn't even ask to have them arrested, but she calls them. They come. They know what's going on. They've been trained in implicit bias. They have a black police chief. They know what they have to do. They go up to the men. They politely ask them to leave. The men can't leave. It's only been 60 years since they were allowed to eat in the same restaurant as white people in the first place. They can't leave. They have to stay. So they decline to leave. The officers know what's up, so they call their supervisor. He comes down to make sure nothing is being done out of the ordinary. He observes this. They ask them once again to leave. They have to say no. They say no. So they arrest them without incident. And they take them out. The system worked exactly the way Abraham Lincoln wanted to work. At the end of the day, the black police chief officer says, my men did nothing wrong, and he's right. They did nothing wrong. This is what the system's designed to do. Thanks to Abraham Lincoln. The comparisons between Abraham Lincoln and Hitler are easy. These are simple. You look at his numbers. In 1860 was the first time we had a census of Native peoples. So we had two numbers in the U.S. Census for Native peoples. We had an estimated number of people who were living in the wilderness, and we had our off-reservation, assimilated, English-speaking natives, people who were a part of society. In 1860, that number was 44,000. In 1870, the decade after Abraham Lincoln's presidency, that number has went down to 25,000. That's a 41% reduction. This is just of the off-reservation, English-speaking, assimilated natives. This isn't even counting the natives in the wilderness that he slaughtered. Again, Nazi Germany had a 35% genocide rate. Lincoln had a 41%. But that comparison's easy. That's simple. What's nauseating is that we're no different than Nazi Germany. We just want our war. We just want our war. Remember, if Germany won the war, how would they portray Lincoln or Hitler? Great. If they won the war, how would they portray the Holocaust? What Holocaust? If you want to compare genocide, in Rwanda, 1994, the Tutsi population went down from 1.09 million 350,000. That's a 68% rate of genocide. World War II, the Jewish population went from 17 million to 11 million, to 35% rate of genocide. In the War of Manifest Destiny, which was 1800 to 1900, the U.S. native population went from 600,000 to 237,000. That's a 60% rate of genocide. And the War of Discovery, and if we take a very conservative estimate of 4 million people in what is today the continental United States, and in 1870 that number was down to 237,000, that's a 94.07% rate of genocide. It was so clear what we were doing that in 1851, in his first State of the State address, Peter Burnett of California, the governor of California, said that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of men to avert.
Well, we cannot anticipate the result. What? Of course we anticipate the result.
The only difference between the United States of America and Nazi Germany is that we won our war. So I want to go back to the statement. The United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. A conversation that's on par with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that took place in South Africa, Rwanda, and Canada. I asked you before this lecture to pick a number between 1 and 10 on where you agree with me. Did my lecture move the needle? We are in desperate need of creating this common memory. George Erasmus is absolutely right. Where common memory is lacking, where people do not share the same past, there can be no real community. If we want to build community, we have to start by creating a common memory. I want to go into the last 20 minutes of the lecture, maybe 15 minutes, but I'll go through this quickly. But I want to talk about how we do this. What do we do now? How do we move this forward? How do we create this common memory? How do we do this? Other nations have had what are called Truth and Reconciliation Commission. South Africa won, and Rwanda and Canada each had one. I think we need something like that, but I don't call it Truth and Reconciliation, because the primary context of our dialogue would be race, correct? Which means we're looking for racial reconciliation. Now, racial reconciliation sounds beautiful, but it's a misnomer. First of all, race is a human construct. There's no genetic definition of race. I don't care what DNA Ancestry.com tells you. There's no genetic definition of race. It's a human construct. And in America, we constructed it for the express purpose of oppressing and dividing. So the black race was constructed through what's called the one-drop rule. The one-drop rule states if you have a single drop of African blood, you're black. Why do we have this rule? Well, blacks were the labor force. We wanted as many of them as possible. The one-drop rule allowed a white slave owner to rape its female slave and produce more baby slaves. The American Indian race was constructed through what's called the blood quantum rule. What's this rule? Well, the blood quantum rule states that you're full, then you're half, you're a quarter, you're an eighth, you're a 16th, you're 32nd, then you're bred out of existence. Why do we have this rule? Well, the mythology is we discovered these lands. There were no people here. We have treaty obligations to native peoples. We want as few of them as possible. So we construct that race to breed them out of existence. Now, reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony. Therefore, racial reconciliation, as beautiful as it may sound, it's a misnomer. It's not accurate. We don't need racial reconciliation. I'd like to say we need racial conciliation. So conciliation can really be the mediation of a dispute. If reconciliation perpetuates the mythology, conciliation gives us a much more honest starting point. This thing began in a mess, we're just trying to make it better. So we don't need a National Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we need a National Truth and Conciliation Commission. Now there's 4 audiences I want to address, and I'll go through them fairly quickly. The first audience is the church. My message to the church is we created this mess. We've been in bed with empire since Constantine. We wrote the Doctrine of Discovery. We used the notion of a Christian and the heresy of the Christian empire to justify slavery and genocide. We are the core of the problem here, the church. And we have to acknowledge our complicity in this. Now, my call to the church, as we acknowledge this, is into what's called lament. I'm actually writing a book on the Doctrine of Discovery. My co-author is Soong-Chan Rah. He's a professor at North Park Seminary. He's written several books. One of his better books, his most popular books, is called The Next Evangelicalism. Just a few years ago, he published a book called A Prophetic Lament. In his book, he identifies lament as it's like being at a funeral church. You have a dead body in the casket, and it's not coming back to life. You go to the funeral church to weep, to mourn, to say goodbye. We have hundreds, if not thousands of years as a church of dead bodies in caskets. We can't fix it. They're not going to come back to life. The only thing we can do is weep. The only thing we can do is mourn. Now in the scriptures, when the people of God lament, when they mourn, when they sit in their brokenness, God always shows up. But our challenge is we do not stay in lament very long. In his book, Soong-Chan Rah identifies the anemic way that the American church laments. I say it's because it's difficult to lament when you believe in your own exceptionalism. There's no space to lament. And so we maybe have a song of lament, maybe we have a service of lament, but we don't stay in lament very long. And when you read the scriptures, when the people of God lament, he always shows up. But he doesn't come quickly. Because we don't stay in lament long enough, we rarely if ever meet God there. Because we're always fleeing him before God shows up. So there's a whole side of God's character that the white American church doesn't know and understand.
Thank you. Because black folks, we can do it, you know, we can do it.
There's a whole side of that the church, the white American church, does not understand because it's never met God in lament. And so my call to the church is we have to stay in a season of lament. But I have to teach the church very carefully about this. Why? Because the church has this very weird, dysfunctional, codependent relationship with the nation-state of Israel. And we do not know how to read our Bibles correctly. And so if you're going to lament, if you're going to sit in the brokenness and just sit in that pain for a while, you have to have some light in the tunnel, right? Something that says it's going to get better, something that gives you some kind of hope. Now, I call the American church to lament the sin of slavery and the heresy of Christendom and the sin of genocide against Indian peoples and boarding schools and everything else we've done. And if I call the church to lament this generation and systemic sin and brokenness, I would guarantee you almost every single church is going to find that hope, or at least look for that hope, in 2 Chronicles 7:14. 2 Chronicles 7:14 says, "If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray, and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, I will forgive their sins," and what?
Heal the land.
Heal their land. Now we forget, we're not Israel. We don't have a land covenant with the God of Abraham. Turtle Island is not your promised land. This is God reiterating the covenant with the people of Israel at the dedication of the temple. There is nothing in Scripture that says if the American church repents, God will heal their land. That's the land covenant. We don't have a land covenant. The problem is in the Old Testament narrative. Americans aren't Israel. We're the pagans. We're the Canaanites. We're the people who don't know God. So our hope doesn't come from a land covenant. Our hope comes from the way that God treats people born in Israel. Our hope comes from the fact that God was willing to negotiate with Abraham over the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. Our hope comes from the fact that God pulled Rahab out of Jericho before he destroyed the city. Our hope comes from the fact that God sent Jonah to Nineveh to prophesy to him. Our hope as Americans doesn't come from a covenant with God. Our hope comes from the character of God. That's a bit harder to put your finger on. I love how C.S. Lewis writes about this in the book The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Have you read this book? The kids, they go to Narnia. They lose their brother to the White Witch. They meet this family of beavers. They're hearing about this character Aslan because it's always winter and it's never Christmas. The White Witch has this land under a curse. They hear about this character Aslan. Apparently he's on the move and he's going to make some changes. And they go to the beaver's house and they're asking questions and they're thinking about this. And finally something begins to dawn on the children. And Susan asks, she says, "Excuse me, but is Aslan a man?" And the beavers laugh. "No, honey," says Mrs. Beaver. "He's not a man. He's a lion." "Oh my gosh," says Susan. "I should be quite nervous about meeting a lion." "Well, you should be," said Mrs. Beaver. "If anyone can stand for Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or just plain silly." And the kids ask, "Well, is he safe?" "No, he's a lion." "But he's good. He's good." Confessing the sin of our nation will not be safe. If you have a child or a grandchild and they beat up a kid and steal their bike, and then they come home to you, and in tears they confess their sin, who lets them keep the bike? Confessing the sins of our nation will not be safe. But our hope as a church is that God is good.
All the time.
God is good. We do not have a land covenant with God of Israel. So we have to think about this completely differently. Now, my next group of people I want to talk to are communities of color. People of color. My message to our communities is about trauma. Now, who's heard of PTSD? Post-traumatic stress. It's an individual diagnosis where a person who's experienced a horrifying event. It affects you physically, emotionally, relationally. It's this all-encompassing diagnosis, but it's an individual diagnosis, it's an individual condition for a person who has experienced a horrifying event. Now there's another trauma out there that's being researched called historical trauma. So historical trauma was actually identified by the psych community to help understand the deep dissatisfaction that existed within Native communities. It's not an individual diagnosis. It's not that person has historical trauma. This community is suffering from historical trauma because they've experienced historical oppression, generational oppression. So it was developed to understand the dissatisfaction of Native communities, but you can see it also in African American communities, in Japanese American communities, in Hispanic communities, and other historically, generationally oppressed communities. You can see these symptoms of historical trauma. I refer to historical trauma as a multi-generational communal manifestation of PTSD. Does that make sense? You have PTSD on an individual level, you have historical trauma on a multi-generational communal level. It's actually been demonstrated to be passed down generation to generation. And so it affects. Now, I use this training when I go out and speak. So if I go back to a reservation and I'm talking to boarding school survivors and people who have been removed from their land, I understand not only the PTSD but also the historical trauma of the community, because I have to be aware that I can say something that might trigger my audience and derail my conversation. The same thing when I talk to African American communities or Hispanic communities or Japanese American communities or Jewish communities. I'm very aware of the trauma of my community that I'm talking to, so that if I do trigger them, I know what to expect, and I can do a better job of not letting the conversation get derailed. Now, I'm asking the people of color in the room, what group is most likely to derail the dialogue on race? White people. Okay? Now there's a third diagnosis that most of you probably haven't heard of. It's called PITS, Perpetration-Induced Traumatic Stress. The psychologist who's doing the most work on this, her name is Rachel McNair. She identifies PITS as being like PTSD in every way, shape, and form, except instead of afflicting the person who is the victim of the horrifying event, PITS afflicts the perpetrator, the person who caused it. She actually looked at a very comprehensive study of Vietnam veterans. She also looked at this quote by Socrates, who said, "The doer of injustice is more miserable than the sufferer." So I hypothesize if PTSD has a multi-generational communal manifestation that we call historical trauma, it makes sense to me that PITS would also have a multi-generational communal manifestation, which is the trauma I observe is afflicting white people. Now, to be clear, white people are not victims of trauma. This is a perpetration-induced traumatic stress, but they do experience trauma. So, one of the first symptoms of trauma is shock and denial. Do I have to say anything else about that?
Say it again.
One of the first symptoms of trauma is shock and denial.
Oh.
Okay? So, we have this very pathology. This isn't racism. This is trauma. Our Congress is so ashamed of what they did to get where they are, they can't even acknowledge it. We have Texas and Oklahoma passing laws you don't teach patriotic history. They're trying to take the word slavery out of history books.
They've done it, exactly.
This isn't racism, this is trauma. They're so ashamed by what they did to become who they are, they can't even teach their own history anymore. American exceptionalism. I refer to American exceptionalism as a coping mechanism of a nation in deep denial of its genocidal past, as well as its current racist reality. So, people of color, how do white Americans go to sleep at night knowing the history of their nation? What's this? Abraham Lincoln, right? Not only did he free the slaves in their mythology, not only did he learn the value of black light in their mythology, he died to free the slaves in their mythology. He is what makes white history palatable to the rest of the world. And to add to that mythology, he was assassinated. He was assassinated on Good Friday. It's no surprise the Lincoln Memorial is modeled after the temple to the Greek goddess Athena. Remember, when Eusebius wrote Christ out of ecclesiastical history, who did he replace it with? Constantine. Eusebius' version of Constantine, or of Christendom, Constantine's the Messiah. In America's version of Christendom, Lincoln is the Messiah.
Well, we can stop looking for Antichrist.
Now, trauma patients have what are called triggers, right? A trigger is a sight, a sound, a smell. Something takes you out of reality and back into the chaos of the moment when the trauma occurs. So if we understand white America as another group of traumatized people, it's easy to see their triggers, right? So, 8 years of a black president was a trigger, right? The optic of seeing a black man governed from an office they constitutionally protected for white men, freaked out white Americans. Without 8 years of President Obama, we never get Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a triggered reaction to white America of 8 years of a black president.
True. Very true.
Any dialogue on immigration or gun control is a trigger. No pun intended.
Yes.
White people cannot have this conversation without screaming at each other. I refer to ISIS as a trigger. Why is ISIS a trigger? Well, they're religious zealots, ethnically cleansing a land to set up their own pseudo-religious empire.
It's us.
This is what we did. What they did. That reflection is so eerily familiar. Paris gets bombed. White Americans make it all about them. Now, one of the reasons I use this paradigm of trauma is because in every racial dialogue, white people generally get put into one of two categories. They're either racist or they're fragile. If white Americans are racist, if you're racist just because you lack pigmentation in your skin, that means every interaction I have with white Americans has to be confrontational. I have to be on my guard, and I have to act like I'm in danger. That's not helpful. If white Americans are racist just by virtue of being white, that means there's no room for them in the conversation. That's not helpful. By the same token, if white Americans are fragile, it means I have to walk around them on eggshells. I can never get to the heart of the matter. That's not helpful either. By understanding white Americans as traumatized, if you go to a counselor when you're traumatized, actually your friends and family know you're traumatized before you are because you're in a state of shock and denial. So if they can convince you to go to a counselor, your first few sessions with the counselor is trying to trigger you, right? Trying to figure out what's wrong with you. What's the connection? Why is there a disconnect between your reality and your memory and your psychological mind? And they're trying to find your triggers. They're asking you questions, they're showing you things, they're exploring conversation. Now, if they find a trigger, let's say butterflies freak you out, and you're talking to your counselor and a butterfly flies through the room for some reason, and you start screaming at your counselor, does your counselor scream back at you? No, why? They know there's something else going on. Does the counselor chase the butterfly out of the room and promise never to bring up butterflies again? No. What did they do? Let's talk about butterflies. Right? This is what's annoying about counselors, right? They find your trigger, then they want to talk about it. Why? Because it's the disconnect. They're trying to establish this connection there. And so this is where I'm saying, because we treat white people as either racist or fragile, we either turn everything into a battle, or we walk around on eggshells and never get to the heart of the issue, which derails every single one of our dialogues. By understanding white Americans as another group of traumatized people, it gives us a better chance of actually getting to the end or further down the line of the conversation. And I can tell you, based on my experience, understanding white Americans as another group of traumatized people has been the most effective tool I've found to not allow my conversations to get derailed. I'll go through these last two very quickly. My third group is Native peoples. My message to Native peoples is that we are not the helpless victims of an oppressive colonial government. We are the host people of the land. And we have to live into our role as the host. I love what happened at Standing Rock. Tens of thousands of people from hundreds of tribes coming together to teach this nation of undocumented immigrants that you cannot drink oil and water is life. Deeply committed to prayer, to ceremony, to the wisdom of the elders, to nonviolent protest. Looking 7 generations behind us and thinking 7 generations ahead of us. I love what happened at Standing Rock. It was an amazing experience. And I want our people to understand that in some very real and practical ways, we are the host people of the land, and we need to be acting out and living into that role as the host. My last group is millennials. Do we have any millennials in the room? A couple. I like millennials. I love millennials. Millennials are now the largest voting bloc in the country. They now outnumber boomers. Millennials have been deeply hurt, screwed by the system. Right? We told you guys to go get a good education, go to college, you'll get a good job. You went to college, we changed the rules on you while you were there. You came out with tens of thousands of dollars in debt. Now you're teaching adjunct at a small university for $350 a unit. Right? But you're not complaining. You guys are driving the gig economy. Can't afford cars, so you're driving for Uber. You can't afford houses, but unless you rent them out on Airbnb. You guys are investing in cryptocurrency and you're freaking out Wall Street. The problem is you're not the problem. The beautiful thing is we have all these colonial divisions. Our political parties, our denominations, race and class and gender identity. And you guys are the most pluralistic generation in the history of our country. Biracial marriage wasn't even legal until the 60s. My parents were like the first ones in line to go and get married after it became legal in the 60s. I was an anomaly for my generation. But my children, which are the millennials and the Gen Zs, for them, biracial marriage, biracial dating, you don't even think about it. Your parents and grandparents went to bed terrified thinking about who you might marry. And you guys are like, you don't even think about it. Right? Your parents were terrified. Like they could not imagine having a friend if they were Christian who was a Muslim or a Hindu or an atheist. And you guys have friends across the board, across all the spectrum. If your parents was a friend with a Muslim, it would be tiring because every interaction would be evangelistic. And you guys are just like, you have friends all across the spectrum. You are the most pluralistic generation. And while I would argue pluralism is not a biblical value, pluralism, I think, is a great antidote to colonialism. And so I see millennials as you guys are decolonizing our country. You're decolonizing our economy with the gig economy. You're colonizing churches because you're not joining denominations. You're doing things through relationships. You're decolonizing our political system by not joining political parties. There's a company called WordPress, one of the most largest blogging sites out there. And they had several years ago, they built a new headquarters in downtown San Francisco. Beautiful building, beautiful headquarters. I read about a year and a half ago that they were closing it. Not because they're going out of business, but because all of their employees are millennials and no one's coming into the office to work. They're all like working in a hammock from the beach somewhere, you know? Like you guys are like, you're changing everything, and it's beautiful. I love what you're doing. You have an inherent value for pluralism. And that's a beautiful thing. In his last State of the Union, President Obama, he was talking about the need in our nation for a new politics. And he said to our country, he said, we the people. Our Constitution begins with these three simple words. Words we've come to recognize mean all the people. Now, millennials, your parents and grandparents applauded this. But you looked at that, and you said, that's not true. When did we decide we the people means all the people? Problem is, we've never decided that. We've never made a group communal decision that we wanted we the people to mean all the people. The founding fathers didn't mean it. Abraham Lincoln didn't believe it. The civil rights movement, for all the progress it brought us, didn't fully get us there. That's why we have Black Lives Matter today. President Trump definitely doesn't believe it. The problem is we've never made a decision. We've never decided, do we want to be a nation where we the people actually means all the people? And I think millennials get this. And because of their voting bloc, because of their decolonizing ways, because of their value for pluralism and being inclusive of everyone around them, I think millennials can actually help us get there. I think they can. Now, at the center of this debate, the most pressing thing that's keeping we the people from meaning all the people, do you want to know what it is? Remember, what did Ruth Bader Ginsburg rule? Land titles. That's what brought out the white supremacists in Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Oh my goodness.
If you own land, the basis of your land title is legally founded in the doctrine of discovery and the belief that native peoples are not fully human. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg chose to affirm that rather than overturn that. Why? Because it would throw this entire system into chaos. The great thing about millennials, right now your greatest asset is your debt. It's your debt, right? And in this last election, this last year, your parents and grandparents just loaded $1 trillion more worth of debt on you. But they did something incredibly shrewd. When they piled that debt on you, they actually made it easier to pass down their wealth to you by limiting the inheritance tax.
Right.
Now, I don't have the stats, but I am willing to bet that outside of the 1%, the majority of wealth in America is owned by the boomers. And in the next 10 to 15 years, that wealth is going to begin transferring from the boomers down to millennials. And if you do not change this in the next 15 years, then just like Ruth Bader Ginsburg chose to affirm white supremacy over the humanity of Native peoples, you will do exactly the same thing. Once you become invested in the system, you have very little motivation to change it.
Right.
So millennials, I'm looking at you. We have 15 years to change this. We have 15 years. On my website, I have an article. It says, what if we struck racism and sexism from the Constitution? What if we actually abolished slavery? And what if we added two simple words articulating the value for life? Now, most Americans, my generation of boomers, believe that the Constitution is a sacred document written by God. But millennials don't believe that. Right? There are 51 gender-specific male pronouns in the Constitution today. Can anyone name for me a board of trustees or a corporate board that governs itself by bylaws written in the 1700s? Nobody does that, right? But we do as a nation. Why? Because we think we're God's chosen people and this is our frickin' Bible. And that's a lie. And millennials, I think you guys understand that. Because it's because of this Constitution. Your parents and grandparents were able to go to the Supreme Court and win the right to not be a cage for people they theologically disagree with. Remember, Christian empire is a heresy. This nation never has been, is not currently, nor will it ever be Christian. We are not here as a church to legislate our theologies. I love this image of Jesus we talked about earlier. When John said, are you the one we're waiting for, or are we looking for somebody else? And Jesus turned around and he healed more sick people. He cast out more demons. He gave sight to more of the blind. And he basically said to John's disciples, go back and tell John, you can either have a Christian empire or you can show mercy to a hurting world, but you cannot be both. You want a Christian empire? You better be filthy. You better be prepared to kill everybody. You want to be the church of Jesus Christ? You can stand up and you can show mercy to a hurting world. We need to make this common memory. We need a national dialogue on race, gender, and class, a conversation that is on par with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that took place in South Africa, Rwanda, and Canada. I am calling it Truth and Conciliation, and my goal is 2021. And I want to invite every single one of you to get on board and help me propose to this country, do we want to be a place where we the people actually means all? Thank you so much.
I think we have 5 till 9. Mark is kind enough to stay to 10, but we did tell you that our ending time is 9.
Yeah.
We're going to open up for questions and answers.
We can do 1 or 2 questions for about 5 minutes, and then we'll take a break at 9. And if you want to leave because you have to go to bed or work tomorrow or whatever else, That's fine. You're welcome to leave, but if you would like to stay longer, they're keeping the building open until 10, and I'm happy after about a 5-minute break to allow people who want to stay to keep dialogue. And if we have a large group, we'll use the mics. If we have a small group, we can just sit in a circle. Go ahead.
I wish I could articulate this as wisely as I can, but short of that, I think what might complicate our country is the fact that, on one level, so many of us are immigrants, and so our national identity is, for some, it's very much entrenched in generations of having lived in the United States. For others, they may be very recently from another country with another whole set of ancestral history and culture. And so I'm thinking that although this is a conversation that speaks very directly to race and etc., that even within that conversation about race, the color of the skin, it gets complicated by, how much you pledge fealty to what this country is all about. Does that make any sense to you?
Yes, I think I understand what you're saying. So you're saying because we're a nation of immigrants, we have people from a large different variety of places here for different reasons, and it complicates the dialogue. I want to respond to that with 2 fairly short stories. The first story is from a metaphor that I use frequently when I talk, and a lot of people ask me, what does it feel like to be Native American and live here in the United States? And I tell people that being Native and living in the U.S., it feels like our Native communities are this old grandmother.
What?
Our Native communities are an old grandmother who has a very large and a very beautiful house. And years ago, some people came into our house and they locked us upstairs in the bedroom. Today, our house is full of people. They're sitting on our furniture, they're eating our food, they're having a party inside our house. Now, they've since come upstairs and they've unlocked the door to our bedroom, but it's much later, we're tired, we're old, we're weak, and we're sick, and so we can't or we don't come out. But the thing that hurts us the most, the thing that causes us the most pain, is that virtually nobody from this party ever comes upstairs, seeks out the grandmother in the bedroom, sits down next to her on the bed, takes her hand, and simply says, thank you. Thank you for letting us be in your house. I think one of the primary challenges we face as a nation is we have this reversal of roles. We have 350 undocumented immigrants who've never asked for, nor have they ever been given permission to be here. They've left their lands, they've left their families, they've left their places of birth, their places of origin, and they've left their stories. So they have no idea why this mountain sits over here. They have no idea why this river flows over here. And because of these things, they live here like someone lives in a hotel room. Meanwhile, our native peoples, our creation stories take place here. They tell us why this mountain sits over here. They tell us why this river flows over here. And they exhort us, even demand us sometimes, to live here sustainably. On some very real and practical ways, I need Americans to understand that they are guests in someone else's house. Just like I need in very real and practical ways our native people to understand we are the host people of the land. A few years ago, 3 years ago, President Obama went up to Alaska and he renamed Mount McKinley back to Mount Denali. Now, decades earlier, when McKinley, before he was president, when he got nominated to become president, a prospector was coming out of then what was called Mount Denali in Alaska, and he heard on the news that McKinley had been nominated by the Republican Party, and he was so excited about this, he decided to rename the mountain after Denali. Now, after McKinley. Now, the Athabascan people of Alaska have been living in Alaska for hundreds, even thousands of years, and Mount Denali is a part of their creation story, and they immediately cried out and said, no, we want to keep it Denali, but it became McKinley, and that name stuck. Now, when President Obama went back, Sojourners asked me to write an article about why renaming this mountain back to Denali was so significant for me as a Native man. The article I gave them was why renaming this mountain was so significant for white people. Ever since it was renamed to McKinley, the Athabascan people have been fighting to have it renamed back to Denali. That's the sacred name of the mountain in their creation stories. They were asking, inviting this nation of undocumented immigrants to use this sacred name. To understand this mountain through the lens of their creation story. They were trying to share their story with these people who had none. And give them some space in this land. That's amazing. That's incredibly generous, unbelievably hospitable. I tell people that the United States of America is a nation that desperately needs to be adopted. It is. It's a nation of people who, except for the African Americans who were brought here as slaves, everyone else is here because in one way or another they were pursuing the American dream. They came here looking for wealth and prosperity. And that was on the backs of the labor of the Africans and the land and the humanity of the Africans and the Native peoples. And they left their stories, they left everything. And so I tell our Native peoples, I say this nation is a nation that needs to be adopted, and the way we adopt them is we share our stories with them. And that's what the Athabascan people did. That's what they were fighting to do ever since it was renamed to McKinley. And so I truly believe the Native, the indigenous people of Turtle Island have a very specific role for bringing some healing and creating some wholeness in this country that is not possible without our not only acknowledgement but our acceptance of the people who are in our house. Thank you for asking that question. I appreciate that. We have one question over here, and then we'll take a short break. Yeah.
First, I want to thank you. Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah.
And I wanted to mention a movement that is happening in the white community and elsewhere right now called mindfulness. Mindfulness is about being present in the present moment without judgment. Big deal, and not easy. One of the main focuses of mindfulness is unseen bias. I remember there's some other people in this room that are a member of these mindfulness of race groups. And what we do is we are investigating our own unseen bias. So this is happening. What strikes me, first of all, is none one of these four target groups that you mentioned, and it's coming across all of them. It is honest, it's hard, and we are trying to do it without a great sense of guilt. So have that, but what you do is the point. It's really being honest and trying to go forward as open human beings, dialogue with whoever, first with ourselves. What's true? Really, because I have lived in a community or in a culture that by its nature I've been conditioned by, each of us. We have been raised in certain, and I'm talking about white people right now, raised in certain ways. What's the bias there? We recognize, not to say it's one of the people, and there are others here who are in the groups. It shifts things. I would hope that your goal will include and be able to absorb some of this mindfulness work. It's so powerful. It shifts much. And I'd love to, I don't know, give you more information about it.
Thank you for sharing that. Let's go and take about a 5-minute break. If you need to leave, that's fine, you can leave. But if you want to just use the bathroom and get something to drink and come back in about 5 minutes, we can do some more Q&A. Thank you everybody for coming. It was a real honor to be here with you.
Thank you.